My name is Karen DeMoss. I'm director for the Institute for Urban Education here at the New School and also an associate professor of education studies here. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's debate discussion. As you can see, this is not really going to be moderated. We're going to let them just talk about the things that they know and work so well. And we will have a Q&A at the end, so we're excited to have you here. The New School, the Institute for Urban Education, and UG College have all sponsored this event tonight, and it's part of a series that the Institute for Urban Education has on catalyzing school change. Tonight's particular focus is context and possibilities, and so there's going to be a lot of discussion about the context surrounding schools and all of the people and players that can influence schools. We're just thrilled you're here. We think it's going to be an exciting evening. If you came in late and would like to be on a mailing list for future events, there's a sign-up sheet outside. And at the end, there'll be some time while we're in here listening, there'll be a bookseller outside setting up for books, and there'll be a book signing at the end. It is an honor for me tonight to be able to introduce the speakers and to open the dialogue and debate, and then Joe and Pedro will just take it from my opening. We are following up tonight on a written exchange that happened in Education Next. And when we knew that we wanted Pedro here, I said, so what kind of thing would you like to talk about with context and possibilities? And he said, Joe and I had this really great online dialogue about some of the issues that our groups are pushing forward, and it would be wonderful to be able to have this as a live conversation, and so that's the way that we decided to form this discussion tonight. That particular piece, for anybody who wants to look it up, is on Education Next, and it's called Poor Schools or Poor Kids. Pedro and Joe inside that piece are representing two different organizations. One organization which has been pressing for school reform, working from questions like standards and accountability, and another organization which has been pressing for school reform, looking at more holistic questions of communities and health and poverty. Those two groups are the Education Equality Project, which Joe represents, along with the work that he does as the executive director of Democrats for Education Reform. And a broader, bolder approach to education is the group that Pedro represents, in addition to all the work that he does himself with his institute over at NYU. Both of these groups would be characterized by many as representing the school liberal side of the school reform spectrum. Their reform agendas share some goals, share some assumptions, but they also really diverge. And tonight is a place where we're going to be able to hear them talk about the nuances and the reasons behind how they diverge on those two school reform agendas. Let me take a moment to do a brief introduction for them both, although they're also going to talk about their backgrounds and how those backgrounds have influenced the work that they do. Pedro Noguera is the Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education at NYU. I could probably read pages and pages of introductions about him and the kinds of work that he's done over time. He holds tenured faculty appointments in the departments of Teaching and Learning and Humanities and Social Sciences at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education and Development, and in the Department of Sociology at NYU. He's also executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education. He's co-director of the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Education in Metropolitan Settings. He is the author of many, many pieces, from The Imperatives of Power, Political Change, and the Social Basis of Regime Support in Grenada, to City Schools and the American Dreams, to The Trouble with Black Boys and Other Reflections on Race, Equity, and the Future of Public Education. Literally, the list goes on and on and on. Let's see, he has appeared on... Yeah, he's a regular commentator. I will just say that he is also a trustee of the SUNY, of the State University of New York, of SUNY system. So he's got a really broad understanding. And Joe Williams has come to us through reporting on education for many, many years. He is the executive director of Democrats for Education Reform. He has a very strong reputation as somebody who can build coalition around education reform change. He is a strong strategist for education reform, nationally recognized analyst and public speaker on education policy. He's a prolific writer and commentator on education. He taps into his experience as a newspaper reporter, where he worked for the New York Daily News and the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. He's award-winning as a journalist, and he's written also Cheating Our Kids, How Politics and Greed Ruin Education. He lives in New York City, where he likes to say, his kids attend public school. So these are our speakers for the night. The format will be that they're just going to take the stage and talk broadly about 3 large areas. One area is parents, communities, and teachers, how they see the influence and responsibilities of these groups for student learning. The second area is teachers themselves, how they see teachers' responsibilities and how to best support and potentially hold accountable teachers for the work that they do. And the third area is politics, those things surrounding all of the questions of school reform that might be influencing both the communities and the teachers themselves. So that is what they're going to be discussing tonight. They will start out first with talking about themselves and their organizations, what they stand for, and since they've already had this conversation, a little bit about how their views differ, and then we'll move from there. We'll have a Q&A in about 50 minutes to an hour, and after about maybe 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A, we'll break for the book signing. Thank you again, and welcome to this evening's discussion.
So Joe allowed me to go first, so I'll just say a little bit about myself that wasn't mentioned. I've been doing work in school reform for about 20 years. So I want to start just by saying, although I'm an academic, I actually do work in schools. All right? I've been a teacher, I've been a school board member. I work closely with school districts right now in Newark, New Jersey, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in Houston, Texas, and in Denver, Colorado, where we are working on transforming, turning around struggling schools. My experience has led me to believe that you cannot address the problems in schools in impoverished communities without finding ways to address some of the effects of poverty. That those effects become academic issues because the unmet social needs of children invariably have an impact on learning and an impact on school performance. And so the broader, bolder approach, which you heard mentioned, is a policy initiative that was launched by myself and several other individuals from academia, from education, the policy world, healthcare, et cetera, who wanted to try to seize the moment as the Congress was considering whether or not to reauthorize No Child Left Behind. And we wanted to try to draw their attention to the clear evidence that No Child Left Behind had failed, had still left many children behind, had left us with dropout rates of 50% and higher in most of our cities, and that we needed a change of course, a change of direction. And part of what we suggested is that at the minimum, we needed to extend learning at time opportunities for all kids because what the research shows is poor children get less learning time than middle-class children consistently. That secondly, we needed to make preschool universal because the gap in achievement doesn't start at 5, it starts well before 5, and most of the countries in the world that outperform our kids have access to quality early childhood education. And third, that we had to expand access to healthcare because health is obviously an educational issue because we have large numbers of sick children who are poorly nourished and whose health has an impact on their ability to attend school regularly and function properly in school. What's interesting is no sooner had we launched this initiative than we heard news that this other group had come into being. And I didn't know Joe at the time was associated with that group, the Educational Equality Project. The names I heard associated were Joel Klein, the former chancellor, Newt Gingrich, the former House Speaker, and Al Sharpton, our local reverend, which to me seemed like an odd combination of characters. And they proceeded to announce that anybody who says poverty is an issue is making excuses, and that the real focus should be on standards and accountability. And I'm sure Joe will elaborate further on what they've called for. And so I would say the debate tonight is between what I would call the broad view and the narrow view. And I'll elaborate further on why I think the broad view is the only way that we'll ever make any progress.
Thanks, Pedro. Thank you for hosting us tonight, and thank you all for coming out in the rain. When I was a reporter at the Daily News about a decade ago in New York, during one of the, if you remember, newspapers in New York City used to print all of the test scores, school by school. I think now you can get them online, so they don't bother wasting all the newsprint to do it. But for all of the hand-wringing that everybody did about testing and the importance of test scores, the reason that we ran them is because people bought loads of papers. They wanted to see how their school ranked. They wanted to see how their school compared to the school that they wanted to get into for their kids but didn't. And they wanted to check and see what the schools were like in neighborhoods where they were thinking about living. And around this time, it was about 10 years ago, New York State for the first time disaggregated its test score data so that they weren't just giving you scores for a particular school and how the students in that school were doing in math or reading. But they gave you the racial breakdown of test scores. So the first time we were able to really quantify in New York City what the achievement gap looked like between black students, white students, between the haves and the have-nots in a lot of cases. And it was astonishing, because we've all become, in some ways numb to seeing the statistics that have come out on this kind of stuff. But I spent the day that the scores came out, like every other education reporter in the city, calling around to black political leaders around the city just to see, what do we make of this? I mean, the gap was tremendous. It showed, which I think is, anybody that's been around the city long enough has figured out, that the white kids in New York City were getting a much better education, seemingly on paper, than African-American kids in the city. And I had experienced this myself as a parent in New York City. I've got a lot of weird stories about sort of the built-in racism to systems, whether it's education or other public systems. So calling around to political leaders thinking this is a pretty important topic. Somebody's going to want to weigh in and talk about, what do we do about this achievement gap? Is it a problem? Is it fake? Is it real? Is the problem real? What do we do? I couldn't get any elected official of color to comment on the test scores that day and the achievement gap that we were seeing, including Al Sharpton, ironically. I got a call back from his spokesperson on Deadline at the time saying, Reverend Sharpton has no comment. And I remember saying in the newsroom, this is the first time those words have ever been put together in that order in the English language. And so we're going to talk a little bit later about politics and how it rolls into this, but this is one of many, many times where, as a journalist, I sort of was confronted by the bizarre politics of education. And what was clear to me in this entire episode and the unwillingness of any elected official to speak is nobody was sure what to say. It wasn't that, I think everybody had thoughts about it. They had gut instincts. They had, clearly had their own anecdotes that they could use to try to tell the story. But the politics of education are so bizarre that, for a long time, people worried that if you said certain things, they were going to think you were against public education. You're against teachers. So part of what my shift from journalism into the advocacy world and this group, Democrats for Education Reform, has been about trying to shatter that part of this political dynamic of education so that we could have more real conversations about what is happening, what isn't happening, what's working, what's not working. And not have to sort of play by a set of guidelines where elected officials, for example, all like to pose for pictures in front of schools when they put them on their campaign literature. But then they don't have answers about what to do about a school that's clearly not giving kids the education that they need to make it in the world. So we'll, I'm sure, go back and forth quite a bit on a lot of this. The Education Equality Project itself, this was both of these groups, EEP and Pedro's group on this, they sort of emerged during the 2008 presidential campaign, and I think that added a lot to this. So the debate isn't quite like flipping a coin and we're saying one thing versus the other. There's some Venn diagrams with some weird overlap, which I think was confusing for a lot of people because, particularly for Republicans, because you had a debate playing out among groups within the Democratic Party, and Republicans weren't really sure where they were supposed to fit. And you can kind of see, I'm sort of jumping ahead to talking about the politics later on, but you can sort of see a Republican Party right now in this country that isn't talking at all about education, other than saying we should eliminate the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. So it took a weird sort of dynamic. I think we thought we were having what was a fun, productive discussion amongst friends in the Democratic Party, and it scared the bejesus out of Republicans, and it's taken a weird turn.
So just in following up, I would say part of the reason that, well, No Child Left Behind was bipartisan, right? Republicans, I mean, George Bush brought us, but so did Ted Kennedy, bring No Child Left Behind. So there was a kind of bipartisan consensus on that as an approach. And so I would say the group that I was associated with tried to challenge that. And now, with respect to the achievement gap, which you started with, I would say that if you were to disaggregate the data further and ignore race, but just focus on where poor children are concentrated, what you would find is the same patterns.
Sure.
Right? That is, the distinct pattern is that wherever poverty is concentrated, the gaps are widest. So I would say, the achievement gap is an educational manifestation of inequality.
Sure.
And that's driven not simply by what happens in school. We've known, the ETS, the Educational Testing Service, is known for a long time. The strongest predictor for how well a student will do on the SAT is family income. Family income combined with how much education the parents have had. Now, unless we think that by reforming schools, we will change that dynamic, I think we're fooling ourselves. Now, it doesn't mean that we ignore schools, because I think some people are willing to go there. I don't go there at all. But I think we at least need to acknowledge that what schools serving poor children are up against is much more formidable than simply what's happening within the school.
I think that's right. Just like you would say, you wouldn't argue that schools shouldn't be ignored. I would argue that poverty shouldn't be ignored. It's clearly an issue. But that what groups like ours have argued is that because of those issues of poverty, it raises the stakes even more on schools. And in some ways, is it unfair to be expecting schools to produce more in poor areas than in non-poor areas? It may be, but it is what it is. And I think that's and that's where the Venn diagrams start to separate a little bit. We also support high-quality preschool options for kids. Universal health care. I think we're going to talk a little bit about sort of compacts between parents, communities, teachers. We believe that communities have an obligation to be making sure that parents have the tools that they need. When children are very young, to make sure that they're being read to in the home, that they're immunized, that they're ready for kindergarten when they start. But at the same time, that the schools themselves, and that's an important part of this, if parents are showing up and having done what they need to do for their kids, schools have an obligation to make sure every child that's in that school gets at least a year of education for the year that they're in that building. And it's and none of this is easy. And as you point out, poverty makes it a mess at times. And but look, I think. And I think you made a pretty good point that to be able to throw out anecdotes about schools here and there that are beating the odds and getting the job done doesn't really help you with systemic discussions about how to change this. But I do think it does reminds a lot of us that the urgency is there. That if kids in impoverished neighborhoods right now are not getting twice the education in some ways that kids in less impoverished neighborhoods are getting, they're not going to have a chance, and that's an obligation we owe to them.
So let me pose a question to you, Joe, because one of the things I find odd is that the Democrats for Education Reform are not really outspoken advocates for greater equity in school finance. Throughout the country, we systematically spend more money on the most affluent children and the least money on the poorest children. In New York City, the differential in what we spend on teachers in the Bronx versus teachers in Staten Island is almost $20,000. Sure. Because we have inexperienced teachers in the Bronx. So what we in effect do is we not only concentrate the poorest children into a single school, but then we assign them with the least experienced teachers. And I have never heard your organization call out this gross inequity that is current throughout the country.
It's a fair point. We supported the weighted student funding in New York City and lost on that, pretty badly. I do think a child is a child is a child. I think the dollar should follow children, and I do think that that there's ways that we can go about doing this particularly to compensate for issues of poverty, special education services, all of that kind of stuff. We're there. I think particularly at the federal level, we fought very hard for it's inside the beltway kind of terminology, by closing the loophole in comparability, so that if federal dollars are going to a school that, and it's being split up evenly, that schools with higher percentages of more experienced teachers, that schools not be penalized based on how much teachers are being paid there. That the money should be going to students, not necessarily the teachers based on their years. And that's been a core part of what we've done at the federal level.
So again, what again concerns me about this is we end up attacking or criticizing the schools that are serving the neediest kids without even addressing their lack of resources, right? Without addressing the fact that, for example, schools in Los Angeles, you have kids in classrooms of 35, 40 students.
Sure.
And we expect those kids to do as well as kids in Beverly Hills. To me, pressuring schools without ever addressing the underlying inequities actually sets up the case that many Republicans would make that we need to scrap public education. And to me, that's dangerous because public education is the only institution that serves all children. So what concerns me about this strategy that I've seen the Equity Party or the Democrats for Education Reform take is that it ends up feeding into this critique that tells us that the Department of Education needs to be eliminated and that public education and teacher unions are the problem. And
yeah, I mean, I don't think you'll ever hear our organization asking for the elimination of the Department of Education. I mean, that is, we're big believers of a federal role in education. I know that's become the new, the Republican mantra, that it should all be local. Our feeling is that we've seen what happens when states or districts are left to their own devices to try to do what's right. And we don't believe this notion that states and districts are just dying to do what's right for kids, but the federal government won't let them right now. So I think that you mentioned the teachers union, and we frequently go at it with teacher unions, particularly on issues in the contract. But that again gets more of the political level that we're going to be talking about later on. I think if we're talking about the balance between communities, parents, teachers, and then teacher unions, that there's everybody's got to be part of a compact about getting this thing done. So this takes this whole discussion into a hypothetical about what could be rather than what is right now. But I agree with you about resources. We've got to be giving schools the tools that they need to succeed if we're going to be expecting as much as we are out of them. I totally disagree. I totally agree with you on that. What I think, and some of this gets again at the politics. I think the concern is if you're having the discussion solely about making sure that it's about early childhood education and making sure that there's adequate health care. If it's just about that, it sort of puts off the discussion about what do we do about schools that, if you look at that compact, whether it's the teachers, the parents, or the community, the schools that those groups know aren't working for kids. And I think that's sort of staring at us right in the face. And if we weren't having the conversation about it before, in the post No Child Left Behind world, there's just a lot more data available that forces the discussion. So that's I think from my own perspective, and I think from a lot of the groups that we're with, I can't speak for Al Sharpton or Newt Gingrich. I wouldn't pretend to. They were clearly there for shock value to try to get people to read a white paper at some point. I think we've been concerned that just like in my reporting example, when Al Sharpton wouldn't comment, that we've got tons of evidence that our schools right now aren't serving kids, particularly low-income kids, the way that they need to be served. And whether it's inputs or outputs or whatever, we're not even having the discussion. There's no outrage. And that, I think, we tend to believe that this is an area that's ripe for a little bit more, some more heated discussions. This is important stuff. It's passionate stuff. People have strong ideas. And for too long, it's been a discussion that's just been swept under the rug.
So for me, though, the question we should be asking is, if we've been reforming schools for 30, 40 years now, and they're still not getting better, particularly in the areas where poverty is concentrated, and again, failure is greatest there, then maybe we should ask, something's wrong with the way we've been approaching reform.
Sure.
And I would say what's wrong is that we think that there's a gimmick, right? We think that there's this policy lever that if we just do this, it'll all get better. If we just make charter schools, it'll all get better. If we just do performance pay, it'll all get, and it never works.
Right.
You know, the Gates Foundation spent $2 billion or more on small schools, only to discover that it took more than making schools smaller to get them better.
Right.
And I would say that we haven't learned from that history of seizing on one piece. Because I think, to speak to the topic, I think we do have to think about how do we generate community resources to support schools,
Sure.
right? In the absence of federal or state, which I don't think there's going to be any anytime soon. Here we have Mike Bloomberg, who has mayoral control. Why is it that the health department and Parks and Recreation and youth services aren't working with schools, particularly in the areas that we know?
It's a good point. And that was the argument for
mayoral
giving the
control.
mayor control.
And I keep asking, why hasn't that happened?
Right.
He gets to call the shots.
I think you're right. I think that sometimes we throw in governance changes in the list of reforms, and at the end of the day, they're just governance changes. It's, you can take whether you have a school board or a mayor. That's governance, and what's happening down at the school is what's happening at the school. It's a totally different thing. So I wonder, what do you think? So you mentioned we haven't really learned that there's no silver bullet to any of this kind of stuff. But what do you think we have learned from 30 years of reform efforts?
Well, we've learned that it's complex. Yeah. That you have to, and I'll give an example.
Nobody likes that word.
They don't like that word, right? Because that means that it's not going to be easy, right? But I do think it's worthwhile to look at schools that are beating the odds, and then to ask why. So I'll give you an example, right? New York, since this is where we are, Hillcrest High School in Queens. It's a large, comprehensive high school, 3,000 students. It does very well, has a graduation rate of over 80%, close to 90%. It serves a large, low-income minority population. Not far away is Flushing High School, has the highest suspension rate in the city. Why is it that the principals and administrators and teachers from Flushing don't go to visit Hillcrest and find out, hey, what are you guys doing? Why is it that kind of collaboration isn't occurring among schools? And I would say part of the reason why is because they're competing. We've set it up as a competition between schools.
For students?
Well, no, for the principals and for the educators. And when they're in competition mode, instead of, it's so sad, because I was just at Flushing High, and he's worried about losing his job because they're on the list that they might be shut down, and he's kind of threatening his teachers. You know what? That's not going to get him any improvement. But it's sad to me that this is what passes as reform right now. I mean, we've closed over 120 schools in New York City. And most of those were schools that were created, they failed under this mayor's leadership. Yeah. And so I would say he should be saying...
There's probably hundreds more that could be closed.
Could be closed based on that criteria. Right. Closings, I keep telling them, your job wasn't to close schools. Your job was to improve schools. If that many schools are failing, then something's wrong with your plan. And New York City, I think, is an appropriate place to look because it was held up. It won the Broad Prize. Joe Klein was held up as the kind of master leader for reform. And we were sold a bill of goods when Bloomberg ran for his third term that he had closed the achievement gap, he had fixed the schools. I mean, it's a farce. Wow. And we need to, this is, to me, is not political. One of the reasons why I thought this was a good idea is because it should not be a partisan conversation. We should really be focused on how to solve this problem. But the politics get in the way because we get politicians who want to claim victories without having even done anything to address the problem.
Yeah, that can be, it's a mess. On the school closure thing, I actually do, I think that the mayor should have closed more schools. I think that's one of the reasons, if you're doing governance changes, one of the reasons you give a mayor control instead of having 32 community school boards and a central board of education is that you want to give a leader a chance to make some bold decisions and cut through where bureaucracy and politics would have stopped you in the past on a bet that you can, at the end of the day, leave things better off than they were. So I think if I try to think of what the mayor, I've never heard the mayor articulate this, and I always wish that he had, that what does a mayor who gets control of the New York City schools want to do? We didn't know he was going to have 3 terms, obviously, but he does. So after 12 years, 10 years, what does he hope to have? And I think that this is, if you think about it, and I view a lot of this stuff from the perspective of a parent, and when I was a reporter at the Daily News, we were obsessed with trying to cover stories from the perspective of parents, trying to quote parents, all that kind of stuff. Does a New York City parent, after this mayor leaves office, have more quality options about, for schools for their kids, public schools for their kids, than they did before the mayor took control? And I don't know what the answer is to that. I actually think that there are more, but I think the only way you can get that is by, realistically, is by starting a whole bunch of new good schools and eliminating bad schools. It's just sort of tweaking both sides of that supply and demand kind of equation. So I'm equally frustrated with years of mayoral control, but I had hoped that the mayor would have been more aggressive, since that was the whole point of giving him control. He always said he didn't care what people thought. I would have thought he would.
That's clear.
He would have done more with that.
Yeah, but I don't know. I would question the logic behind it. If there was too much crime in a neighborhood, we wouldn't say let's shut down the police station. We would say let's figure out why there's so much crime. Maybe we need to approach this differently than we have. We might need more police there, right?
Or a different precinct commander or
right.
whatever.
So the question is, why are they failing? And I would say many of those schools were designed to fail. They were overpopulated with high-need students and staffed by inexperienced teachers. And so they were set up from the very beginning. And there's a report that the DOE commissioned by Parthenon that shows this, that many of those schools had no chance.
Of the new schools that they started.
Not just the new schools. This is particularly true of many of the traditional schools. So again, I don't want to have New York dominate, but I do think that it speaks to a larger problem, because this, I don't know if we want to go to race for the top, but now we're talking about this is the threat we want to use as on failing schools. We want them to either transform or be shut down.
Right.
And again, I think it's looking for simplistic solutions to complex problems, and they're not going to.
I think with race to the top, though, the broader deal on that was, I think, it was bigger. I mean, the race to the top was $5 billion of $100 billion worth of stimulus money that went to public education. It was an awful lot of money that came out of Washington toward public schools. Did it all get spent in the ways that we'd be happy that it got spent on? Probably most of it didn't. But it kept a lot of teachers around the country on the payroll for another year. It gave states another year to put off having to make some really difficult cuts to public education. So to cut out just a tiny sliver of this and say to states, in order to get this money, we're going to expect that you're going to do something with it. I think it was the right starting point for the deal. I think we could get down to each point, and you can have a decent debate on whether it made a lot of sense or not, and there's probably a lot of things that didn't. The school turnaround stuff, we are worried that so much money is being put into school turnarounds without a lot of evidence that it does a lot of good in the end. But that's where, I mean, we do think that we actually, rather than sort of peeling the Band-Aid off and trying to do fake turnaround efforts where you change the name of a school, do some professional development, but don't really do much else in a really bad school that hasn't worked for years, that you're better off just closing that thing down and trying to take advantage of the one thing that was probably decent, and it was the building itself. Trying to find another school that can run a better program within the same school building, whether it's a public school, a charter school, or whatever.
No, I would agree. I think that putting stimulus money into Race for the Top was crucial, given the state of the economy, given the way states were cutting back on schools. It's just that I think both the federal government and the state governments have not gotten any better at all on how to provide help to schools. And if there's anything we should have learned from 10 plus years of No Child Left Behind, is that it takes more than mandates. It takes more than threats and pressure to get schools to improve. And that's the part that I find most frustrating. And I say this as a person who advised the Obama administration early on during the transition and would love to see the president get reelected. So I'm not doing this as someone who is simply a critic. But I have to call it, even when they do things like Common Core standards, which I support, because I think it is important to have clear academic standards, I still think they don't get it, that the hard part is helping schools to then be able to teach kids to those higher standards. That's the hard work. And
what role do you think that the federal government could or should play?
I think they should shine the light real brightly on places where it's being done right, and in a variety of places with a variety of populations of kids.
Do you think that gets the job done? I
don't know if it would.
When Margaret Spellings was education secretary, it's like every week they sent out another happy story, and it was all happy, happy, happy. And meanwhile, we got kids who can't read all over the place. And it's nothing against the happy stories, but to your point before, I don't see people taking the happy stories and trying to figure out what they do with them.
I don't think a happy story is going to turn it around, but I do think we need to find ways to more systematically provide guidance to schools on what to do under their conditions that they're faced with. And I don't see many districts that, one exception I would say is Montgomery County, Maryland. I thought got very good at that, and it showed in their outcomes. I think there are a couple other examples, Brownsville, Texas, and a few others, but I don't know of any states. It's interesting because Massachusetts, which is often held up as the leader because they have the highest NAEP scores in the country. Paul Revell, the state commissioner now, he sounds like he's with the broader, bold approach. He's saying the issues are poverty, the issues are inequality, and we've got to do more to address those issues than simply continue to rely on higher standards.
From your perch on the state university board and the charter school board and authorizing charter schools, do you see charter schools and district schools in some place like New York City or any place around New York State talking together about what's working, what's not working, and if so, how is it going? If not, why not?
No, it's not happening, and that's one of the things that really frustrates me is because, in fact, the SUNY charters are some of the highest performing charter schools in the country, but there's no conversation even within the same building. Now, I would also add, though, that that's true often with public schools, that they're not sharing they're not learning from each other as well. And I think that's much more an issue. I don't think you can expect the principals to do that work. Somebody beyond the school needs to facilitate that kind of cross-fertilization, but it's not happening among the charters.
Did that kind of cross-fertilization among public schools happen 30 years ago before we got into this?
No, it doesn't even happen from one teacher next door to the other teacher half the time. I could say I go often to a school, you'll see highly effective teacher next door to somebody who's not, and there's no sharing, there's no collaboration. So I think that's a problem that's endemic to education, the way we do things.
Sure. What do you think? I actually have a lot of respect for the work you do with communities and in schooling. So I think that was one of our points that you wanted us to get at. What do you think? What do you think communities should be expecting of schools, and what should schools be expecting of communities, and how do parents and teachers fit into all of that?
Well, I would say that it's different depending upon the kind of community and the resources in that community. But to be trite, I would say if we treated our schools the way we treat our football teams, our schools would be fine, right? We will invest public dollars into football teams. We will subsidize them. It has nothing to do with whether or not they win even, right? We'll still do it, right? Because we somehow, having a football team is a glamour symbol for cities. We don't do that for schools, and we don't make the kinds of investments. And I don't just mean in terms of buildings or dollars to personnel. I mean, we have schools that need social workers, that need guidance counselors, that need lab equipment. We don't, like the basic inputs, and that need volunteer mentors, that are not being, so we have communities that have people who could help that are not organized to support schools. So I would say that, to some degree, that work can only happen at the local level. And we're trying to do that right now in Newark. And Newark is a place where there are a lot fewer resources to tap. But there are still resources. There's a medical school, there are hospitals, there are nonprofits that all need to be enlisted to support their school.
Do you think, and I agree with a lot of what you said, do you think communities have a role in raising expectations for what schools are producing?
Absolutely.
I think, and I used to live in Milwaukee, and places like Cleveland, Detroit, some of the, New York City is different than a lot of places in that the civic culture here is going to survive even if the schools are terrible. But in a place like Cleveland, Ohio, they can't attract people to work. I think you've got more complicated conversations between the broader community and what the community needs to be able to survive itself, and what the school's role has got to be in there. How does a community have the right to tell a school it needs to be doing a better job?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's the only way I think schools will improve. But that's the reason why I would say that a market model of reform, where we treat parents as consumers, doesn't get that. What we need is parents who are actually partners of schools, to hold schools accountable, right, and to scrutinize and put pressure on schools, because I think that's healthy, but at the same time also are supporting their children and doing their part.
Do you see that as a compact?
I think that's a kind of compact, absolutely, that we need to forge.
I do too. I think it's, and I don't know how you translate. I don't know how you translate that into action later on. You're probably, you've studied that more than anybody. But I look at a place like New York City, where you've got, actually, and I used to hear, New York City is so crazy because there's, I don't want to talk about New York too much, again, like Pedro said, but it's got everything here. You've got amazing schools, you've got terrible schools, you've got schools where you have parent-teacher conference and no parents show up, and you got parent-teacher conferences where you got too many parents and you can't actually do a conference. You get a minute and a half with the teacher. How does a place like New York City sort of deal with the reality that there's going to be different types of parent involvement and parent engagement at the local levels? Do schools have, should they be expected to overcompensate when parents aren't doing their jobs because they know that that something needs to be done? Do communities need to overcompensate if parents are? If parents are doing their job, should we be giving them more than a minute and a half to meet with their teachers at the parent-teacher conference? How do all these pieces fit together between how do we get from what we've got now toward what would be ideal?
Well, I'd say that we need to understand what the issues of a community and the needs of a community and develop strategies that are appropriate to that community. You're right that in an affluent community with working parents, usually parent involvement is not an issue. When you go into communities where parents are working hard, or where there are no parents, or parents are just not able to provide that support, then we need to compensate. And those are the schools, again, that's the area where we need more resources. We need social workers. We need people who can organize parents and do the outreach to them. But those are the kinds of investments, I think, that, and the kind of strategies that need to, I support the idea of mayoral control, if that's what it results in that kind of strategic thinking. I kept asking this of Joel Klein when he was here. I said, his mantra was accountability. I said, what are you accountable for? And it can't just be that you're accountable to holding everybody else accountable, right? And I don't think we've ever spelled out how it works at the top, right? What is the mayor accountable for? What is the chancellor accountable for? How do we judge them? And on what basis? We can't just wait until they're out of office, because that's too much time.
It is. And there was a time when, I think it was during the campaign for fiscal equity lawsuit, when the special masters were hearing testimony, and Mayor Bloomberg testified there, and they asked how he would be held accountable, and he said that people could boo him when he marched in parades. And I thought, well, I'm not sure that was what the point was.
That's sufficient.
I had a principal told me one time that he wasn't sure what was worse, a parent who cared about his kids or a parent who didn't, and I think that's an interesting question as you sort of get into what parents' roles are in this kind of thing. But what about teachers? What do you think? What role how should teachers be held accountable? What should teachers be expecting of parents, communities, Joel Klein, Dennis Walcott, whoever's in charge?
Well, I think this is another area where the idea that teachers should be accountable for producing evidence that kids are learning is right. It's right in principle. But if we reduce that evidence to how well they do on a standardized test, then it becomes a perversion. Because then what you do is you drive teachers to then even focus more narrowly on test preparation. And again, these are the ways the
It doesn't really have to be that way, though. I mean, isn't there a way to be able to have some kind of concrete measurement that gets used that doesn't become this crazy manic obsession?
Well, I mean, I think there are ways to do that, but I haven't heard them come out of state capitals. Sure. And what I have heard is that this desire to use test scores, and that's what's being negotiated.
Yeah.
And
so it usually ends up being what percentage of a teacher's evaluation ends up being test scores,
right. And how do we judge the art teacher? How do we judge? I mean, it becomes a crazy kind of debate when.
Do you think test scores have any role in that?
I would say sure. We should look at test scores, but we should also look at what's actually happening in the classroom, and we should have people in there who know about teaching and understand the dynamics of a classroom, kind of evaluating and assessing.
When you guys at SUNY are evaluating, charter schools, after 5 years to decide whether it gets to stay open, it's largely test scores, right? But also visits.
Lots of visits.
Visits and reports that are drawn up by all the visitors. Do you think you guys have the right balance of test scores and other observations and that kind of thing? And is there any lesson to be learned from the way you guys evaluate whether a school is working or not to whether or not a classroom particularly is working?
I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned because it's a very labor-intensive process. It involves a lot of feedback to the school, so it's not simply giving them a letter grade. It's giving them real feedback on what you need to do differently before and over an extended period of time. And what we've seen is that schools are pretty responsive to it. I was talking to a charter school in the Bronx 2 weeks ago, and I said, why did you guys choose to go with SUNY? Because SUNY is a much more rigorous authorizer. They said, because that's what we want. We want that kind of feedback. We want to be held to a high standard. So I think the process does work well, but it comes with a lot more support to schools than you typically see from either the state or the districts.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the politics of this, a lot of the teacher evaluation stuff, it wasn't really moving anywhere until Race to the Top, and now it's all over the place. So you went from 100 years where teachers were evaluated as either satisfactory or unsatisfactory, and now we're in the fast lane here, and it's moving pretty quickly. And I think some of that is because it needed a jolt to get going, and I think I can tell you, our organization hopes that this is the time that calm, level-headed people emerge to make it work, but that there's still some pushing that's needed, and that the politics of teacher evaluations have gone from no to yes, and now we've got to get to in between. How do we get this thing to work?
The how.
Right? The how, yeah, the how. A lot of this stuff does, and I think that it's easy to be critical about the pushes that get it moving, but understanding that without those pushes, nothing would be moving at times, I think it's an important part of the ebb and flow of this, and that's how we approach it. That there's times to, and we worked a lot on teacher evaluation, and having the incentives that the federal government was providing to states at a time when they desperately need money was a way to break the logjam that prevented any change in the past. And a lot of this stuff was battles with teacher unions around the country. But the best as I could tell, the teacher evaluations were not, I mean, existed long before teacher unions existed. I mean, these were on the books like 1925 or something like that in New York City. This is one where I don't blame teachers unions for it. I think that a lot of the resistance that we're getting at state capitals is coming from lobbyists that are representing teacher unions, and to their credit, they wanted to focus on the how. But that in order to get things done, you sometimes need to push pretty hard in order to get the how into the conversation. So that's, I think, and it sort of goes back to the big picture of the EEP kind of stuff, is I think that there was a feeling on a lot of the groups that were represented in there that these issues were important enough, and the situation was critical enough that it needed some tough love to break things loose and to see where things could go. I think we're at a point now in the next couple of years on teacher evaluations where we have a chance to get things right for the next 50 years if we do it right. We also have the chance to screw it up for 50 years if we get it wrong. So the pressure is going to be on, but this is where the give and take matters, and I think it's going to be healthy.
We'll see. I don't know, you wanted to open it up, Karen? Oh.
You have anything to say on the
Well, just that I hope. I mean, I appreciate your optimism. I'm not sure if that's if that's where I see it playing out. I think that what I've seen happen repeatedly is that we keep seizing on these policy gimmicks and say this is what's going to fix it, and then we drive that point. And usually, the policymakers, if they can win and they can get it, and then there are these. I'll give you an example. Massachusetts was one of the first states to adopt the high stakes test, and I was in a debate there before the state legislature, and I said then there was not a single member of the legislature who could guarantee that the kids who would fail the exam had been prepared. And they said that's right, and we're going to do it anyway, and they did. And there was Democrats and Republicans, and 6,000 kids who would have otherwise graduated were denied diplomas, and they declared victory. And it only makes sense if you know who those kids were. 1/3 special ed kids, 1/3 English language learners, the other third kids from Boston and New Bedford who were going to terrible schools who we knew in the first place didn't have a chance. What concerns me is that when you push for these simplistic solutions and don't think through the consequences, there are casualties. And the casualties often are the kids, the most vulnerable kids.
Sure.
Thank you very much. We have a microphone over here for folks who would like to be able to be on the video, and please go right ahead. And I've got this for folks who want to just raise your hand. I'll bring it over for Q&A.
Thank you. First, could I ask you to do several more forums? I'll have several topics to suggest. Because there are a few elephants in the room that we can't possibly touch on in this amount of time. But one is the whole school privatization push. And for that, I refer everybody to an NPR, WNYC segment today on Leonard Lopate, which will be a podcast, I'm sure, on how the online schools are becoming the latest wedge in privatization, but certainly the charter schools have been that in the minds of many, many on-the-ground advocates such as myself. So I'm a parent, New York City parent, and also founder of the Right to Read Project. And another elephant in the room is the literacy issue. And Mr. Williams said in passing, and I'm not faulting you on that, you at least said it, but I can't tell you how many times I hear this said in passing, and yet it is such a big issue in the struggling schools. We have so many kids who can't read, you said, all over the place, meaning I assume all over the country. And if 4 out of 10 have trouble learning to read, and they get progressively concentrated into fewer and fewer schools, those are the struggling schools. And so shutting them down, it will just disperse those children elsewhere. I do have questions. Okay, so my question to Mr. Williams is, in your role heading Democrats for Education Reform, we have the impression, we on the ground, parent activists, have the impression that politicians who are getting money from your organization suddenly aren't saying anything about co-locations of charter schools. And it seems to put you in something of a Grover Norquist role with these politicians. We don't know that they're signing pledges about charter schools, but it has that aspect. And that is of grave concern. So I'd
you're
put
asking,
that out to you.
is there a pledge? There's no pledge.
And I said one for Mr. Noguera, Dr. Noguera. The DOE has said that they're only going to give chartered schools now to 3 organizations. And I would say, isn't that restraint of trade?
Well, the DOE isn't an authorizer anymore of charters. It's only SUNY and the state.
But only to 3, Harlem Success, PIP, and
No, I don't think that's right. Because there are, I mean, I know of several community-based groups that have charters and that are opening schools. Just on the point of charters, because I think a lot of the opposition I find to charters is hypocritical. That many of the people, I challenge a number of people who are attacking, first of all, I don't think they've been to them, but second of all, there are many public schools that screen kids, right, on the basis of student achievement or something else, but I hear no outrage about that in the city. I think the real question we should be asking about charter schools is, are they accountable? Are they accessible? And are they doing what we expected them to do, because they're still being supported with public dollars? But to me, we've needed some way to shake up this system and to create better options for families. And many charter schools are doing that. And so I find it odd that so many people would attack these schools when and I think the ones that are not doing a good job should be criticized. But the ones that are should be supported.
But for what it's worth, my kids attend DOE schools that you have to test to get into. So they attend schools that are creaming. And before that, they attended an elementary school in District 2. For those of you familiar with Manhattan District 2, it's essentially a district that was gerrymandered to appease white families in Manhattan. And not only, so even within that district, when I enrolled one of my sons in kindergarten, I showed up with, you have to bring your electric bill and all the, the birth certificate and all this kind of stuff to prove that you live there. When I walked in, they gave me the gifted and talented application for a separate program within the school. Because it seemed, because I was a white guy coming in, that they just assumed that I was going to send my child to a gifted. I was flattered, but I said, my kids are great, but I don't know if they're gifted. But so this is all, it's all complicated stuff, and I think Pedro's point about the discussion about charter schools. Look, I'm a defender of charter schools, and I would say all of this stuff needs to get more real. We need to have more real conversations about charter schools. I think that there's a lot of charter schools that we should be talking about closing down, to tell you the truth. So I think that that's the fact that we've got to speak in so many codes and everybody has to pick a corner and you got to stay in your corner when you talk about it. It's not really helping us get anywhere in the discussion. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Safo, and so first, I just want to thank you all for coming here, and I really enjoyed a lot of this conversation, especially talking about equity, talking about discrimination, and like disparities within education. But I think that one thing that's missing from the conversation, I think, is unpacking what we mean by education and what we mean by success. And a lot of times, I think we conflate. On one hand, there's education as in learning, as in like things that like something that's of intrinsic value to itself, right? Being able to read, being able to think critically. But on the other hand, we conflate that with education as a commodified, quantified concept of having a diploma and having certain test scores. And why do we place value on that? And I think that part of it is that this serves as a gatekeeper, right? This serves as a gatekeeper for access to institutional privilege. There's a limited number of space openings in colleges, right? There's a limited number of high-paying jobs, and when we're talking about this, we're talking about class, and I think that we have to look historically at why there's this segregation, why is it racialized, why are certain people only having access, and it has to do with histories of colonialism and histories about capitalism, and I think what we're seeing that there's only so much access, right, to a limited number of positions, and I think that talking about upward mobility, talking about
Can you share your question?
Yes,
Thanks.
Talking about mobility is extremely important. But my question is my question is, what do we do about the fact that, still there's ultimately only a limited number of positions, and we need to be addressing why is it that some people are making more money than other people at all?
Well, I'll respond to the one part about that. I think you're right that we should be asking the question: what are we educating our kids for? Right? That is, and what, we have to think ahead. I mean, we have this focus now that it's all about college. And even though we know, for example, lots of kids aren't going to college, and that college is increasingly unaffordable for lots of kids, and that we would be, many kids are going to have to work through college and are not being prepared to work at all. And so I would say that we've distorted things by this. There are schools, Automotive High School, Merrill Tish was there a week ago, described as one of the worst schools in the city. That school should be preparing the next generation of people going to build cars and fix cars. Right. I think it's a very narrow vision that's driving a lot of our reforms. I also think that we're not asking the right questions. We're asking how to raise test scores, and we should be asking how do we get kids excited about learning, and what would it take to create schools where kids were excited about coming there and felt good about learning. And I think that when you end up with non-educators running the system, who think of schools as like corporations, you end up with the focus becoming distorted, and I think that's what we've seen.
I don't necessarily disagree. I do think that if education is happening right, the test score kind of obsession falls apart, because really those tests are just there to make sure basic skills are mastered. I think that this is all about preparing young people to become citizens. Like, our jury systems don't work if people don't understand, basic jury instructions. People can't vote if you're in California, you got to vote on all these referendums every year. If you can't read the ballot, you're not going to be able to participate in a democracy. If you can't read the newspaper and understand where everybody is on issues. I think that's the purpose of education, and I think that the best schools today, even no matter what the hoopla is that's going on around this stuff, keep focused on that kind of stuff.
Hi, I was thinking that I really liked the comments that were coming out about community, and that you made the point that New York's so diverse in its results and its communities, i.e. there are great schools and there are bad schools and there are things going on that are difficult to gauge. And I think like this idea of training teachers in different ways, or even, you said about the health department or other institutions having some sort of mentorship program or some sort of community structures where there's some sort of sharing or collaboration between schools. And my question is kind of like, have you seen any examples of maybe those types of structures that have been successful or that have worked, or between schools and with each other, or with other institutions that you've seen work before?
I'll give you an example. A principal, she said, my kids have food fights every day, and I don't know what to do. I said, they've had food fights. She said, it's disgusting. They're throwing food. I have to have a teacher at every table. She said, what do I do? Now, first of all, I think it's ironic that she comes to me. She doesn't go to a superintendent. She doesn't go to Tweed. She comes to me to ask. I said, well, I will take you to a school a few blocks from where you are where they never have food fights, so you can talk to that principal and see what they do differently. And I did. Now I don't know if she's able to pull it off yet to stop the food fights, because that's usually an indicator of a deeper problem, of a school where there's so little respect for what's going on that kids are literally throwing food at each other, right? And she might not even be capable of dealing with that issue. But why does she have to come to me? Why isn't there a resource within the Department of Education to help her with a problem as simple as that?
And just to very quickly add to this, I think some of the things that Pedro mentioned earlier, but it's one thing to go and look and visit and collaborate, but it's also, if you don't truly understand what's behind what's successful there, you may pick the wrong thing and bring it back. I mean, just a couple of years ago, everybody thought if you made kids wear uniforms to school, all of a sudden they were going to be little Einsteins running around. And to the example of, we sometimes go through these right now, extending the school day is something I think we both sort of support, but and I think you probably agree with this. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if it's just about changing what time kids leave and not really being thoughtful about what you do with that extra time, you've sort of missed the point of it. And that's it sort of gets back to Pedro's point about how we can take steps that seem like we're doing the right thing, but if we're missing what's really happening, it doesn't get us very far.
I couldn't agree more. Changing the time of 8 o'clock class is a hard one to get to. I just want to say about teacher evaluation. I teach at a large high school in the Bronx.
Which one?
DeWitt Clinton. So the whole thing, when I first started, I was in the TOPS program of CUNY, and I had a mentor, and it was great. And then after 2 years, he evaporated. So I come from a soccer refereeing background. A professional game I refereed always had a former professional referee assessing us. I don't know, maybe this thing's in the works, but if there's an assessment program by the DOE of great teachers and a new career path for them to be professional teacher evaluators, maybe this is already, excuse me, in progress, but instead of an AP or a principal who's overloaded and all these other concerns, someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight in a school. So I just throw that out.
It's an interesting idea, and I think it gets at the politics of this issue. I mean, one of the reasons it's tough to pull this off politically is teacher unions are saying they don't trust the principals. It's not even a matter of whether they've got this, whether.
I'm sure that a principal, this is my school, 20 years, I want my teachers doing it this way. You're going to have that battle.
It's right, but what you're talking about is like if we get to a point where we realize some assessment needs to take place, whereas before we were saying nothing, then there's a chance to figure out how do you make it work. And
some super former teacher who doesn't have a dog in a fight yet.
Right. Right, but the part of a former teacher, someone who actually understands the work.
Someone's been there.
That's right.
In the trenches. Yeah.
That's right. And in fact, the Netherlands, that's the kind of system they use. It's called the inspectorate that comes in. And they go into the school, and they go into classrooms, and they give real feedback on what's going on.
And the model's there.
That's right. And it's not a punitive system. It's really a system to help the school to improve.
Trying to help you, not to break you. Yeah?
The inspectorate sounds pretty scary, though.
It does sound scary, though. The inspectorate is going.
So, thank you.
I have a question. If I were to give each of you 500 kids, 125 kids in a grade, 9 to 12, in a high-poverty district, 20% L's, 20% special education, what kind of school would you create and why? And what would be your biggest obstacle to doing the vision that you had for that school?
I mean, you wouldn't want me running the school. I'm not a school creator, and I'm actually when I lived in Milwaukee is like the capital of school choice there. We used to have these. Even in the public schools, there's private school vouchers there, but even in the public school, like for kindergarten, you had to decide whether you wanted to send your kids to a Montessori kindergarten or a Waldorf kindergarten or an arts kindergarten or a German language immersion or French language immersion, all these kind of stuff, and I got totally confused. And they all looked like they had good elements to it and bad elements to it, and I'm more interested in schools that have a good team, where you've got a team of teachers working with a leader that seems to be helping them get to where they need to go, and find ways to involve parents and the communities. What the school looks like is less important to me, but that's just me. I'm sorry, that's a lame answer to what was a very good question.
So, I think about that a lot. And I would create a school kind of like Renaissance High School in Queens. Renaissance is a charter school. It's one of the only unionized charter schools in the city. Every grade has a theme that, it's actually a K-12 charter, and it's a 12-story building. And each grade, their theme is around, the environment or theater, and the whole curriculum is coordinated around that. And there's a high degree of collaboration amongst teachers and kids. I'll give you an example. When I was visiting the school, saw a kid with that baseball hat on. So I said to the principals, give me a tour. I said, "Oh, you let kids wear hats here?" He says, "Sometimes." He said, "Why don't you ask him?" So I said, "Why? Are you allowed to wear hats here?" He said, "Well, it's going to take me a while to explain." He says, "Well, we had a town hall meeting about hats because we had Muslim girls at the school who wanted to wear headscarves, and so we had a vote, and everybody agreed they could wear headscarves. Then we had Sikh students who said they want to wear turbans. We had another vote. He said, then the hip hop kids said, well, we wear hats. That's our culture, and we want to, and the teachers were adamant, no hats. He said, but the agreement was that for kids who are doing well academically and are engaged, they can wear hats in the hallways. Right? So I'm doing well, and that's why I get to wear my hat, right? And so it was also a school practicing democracy and a sense of responsibility with kids. And I think they're asking very different questions. Their most popular extracurricular activity right now at the school is a gourmet cooking class, right? Taught by a top chef who comes, and kids are lined up to get in there. They're trying to find ways to make it exciting and compelling to be at school. And they're getting much better outcomes as a result. So that, to me, is the kind of schools we should be creating a lot more of. The biggest obstacle is getting everybody together, united around a common vision of what we're trying to do. And they've been at it for a while, so they figured it out. Now, that same school, they're trying to replicate in East Harlem right now, and they're having a hell of a hard time. But for one thing, 40% of their kids are special needs. So they have a very tough population. But they're also taking a while for the staff to gel as a team.
Hello, over here. I'm curious as to whether there's a conversation happening between charter schools and district schools. You spoke, Dr. Noguera, a little bit about how there isn't really a conversation happening between charters or even from classroom to classroom. But one defense that I, and I think other people who advocate for charter schools or the necessity of charter schools is that they provide a model or a kind of laboratory to experiment with new models that could possibly be taken and put into district schools. So is there that kind of conversation happening between these schools that you know of?
No, again, I think that's the sad thing. That's not happening. And some of the schools have figured out some pretty good things. I'll give you an example. The Success Academy School, started by Eva Moskowitz, who's getting beaten up tonight in Brooklyn about creating another school over there. They decided a while ago, to introduce blocks, right, into kindergarten. But then the kids were throwing blocks at each other. So they actually realized they had to teach kids how to play blocks, and that they just spent a little time teaching, they could actually use the blocks to do all kinds of really interesting things with kids. They're in another school that's a totally dysfunctional, regular public school, and there's no sharing, no conversation. And that, to me, is such a lost opportunity. So I'm seeing that throughout the city, that the collaboration, the sharing, and I don't blame the schools, I blame the DOE, because it's not fostering it, it's not encouraging it, and it's not facilitating it.
I think it is hard when, there's a war in New York City right now over charter school locations. I think it's hard for whether it's district principals or chartered principals or leaders to even think about how they're going to get together to do this when they're just trying to survive every day in the sort of the battlefield that's playing out. But I just and I do think and I agree with Pedro, and I think there's a number of around the country, small, I wouldn't say meaningless, but collaboration is happening among some charter leaders and principals, not enough to do anything systemic. But what you're starting to see happen as where the issue is getting forced and it's not necessarily being viewed as a collaboration, where people are starting to say, well, why is that one school doing better than the same school down the street? And whether it's a charter school, a district school, whatever, and then all of a sudden it's starting to get to, well, they're there, the kids are there from 9 o'clock until 5 o'clock, and then it forces the discussion, why isn't it that way in the other school where the kids are leaving at 3? And so some of the, we do work on extended learning time legislation around the country, and that it's in some ways it's benefiting from these discussions that are creeping up about comparison. So even if they're not necessarily, even those two principles aren't talking to each other, the fact that we've got results for one and for both, and discussions about obvious things that are happening there and not happening in the other, it's starting to play out. So we may get there even in spite of all the wars.
But I will just add that one of the things it'll take us to is that some of those schools are spending a lot more on their kids.
Sure.
And they're being subsidized by hedge funds and by private, philanthropists, and And what that's showing us is that's what it really costs, right? And that we are underspending on other kids. And so that's got to become part of the
That's a good point.
conversation,
And if I could just for a second talk about why a group like ours, Democrats for Education Reform, has been interested in charter schools. Is we've started long after charter schools have started. And in New York State in particular, the early days of the charter school movement was led by a lot of Republicans. And when you heard them talk about the virtues of charters before they actually existed, when it was just a concept, and we're dealing with ideologues, they would talk about how charter schools could do a better job for less money. And when you start to see not the ideologues, but the people that are actually involved with schools, even whether they're funding schools on boards, they start to realize pretty quickly that, one, it's harder than they thought it was going to be, and that it does cost money. It costs a lot of money to do the job right and to provide all the kind of services you want. So I think there's a potential for the politics of this to change even further, where you have a lot of people in public education who have been trying to argue, without a lot of people listening, that more resources are needed, who have been fighting battles with charter school people for a long time. There's a common agenda there that could be quite powerful at some point if they're both teaming up to fight for more funding for both charter schools and district schools.
Joe, I'm sensitive to the fact that you have a plane to catch. So we have one quick last question, very quick, so keep
Thanks.
your responses real tight, too, so that we can have the book signing.
Real quick point to the teacher in, I think, the Bronx, who wanted to know any place that the teachers are, like they have model teachers to work with. Baltimore has a great contract for that. I don't know if he's still here. Yeah, hey. Real quick question. I was a 10th grade English teacher in Baltimore, and I liked being held to a standard and being judged based on how my students did on that. My only issue was it was an 8th grade test written for 10th grade students. So how do you, or how can you, legislate quality?
Quality in teaching?
In
assessments?
assessments.
In assessments.
Well, you can't.
You know, interestingly enough, I think this is like a Big Bang theory. So you've had assessments that were not designed for what we're trying to do with them right now, and all of a sudden now this forces the issue back. So you deal with a teacher evaluation piece that, in order to have a realistic discussion about it, the reality that the tests aren't up to what you need them to do pops into it, and then you've got to tackle that at the same time. And that's it's the messy part of this. But just like schooling, legislating anything in education reform is messy at the same time. But I do think that there is more of a push to improve tests now as a result of the fact that there's consequences attached to them.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big question about assessment in itself. I think we're mostly using it the wrong way. We should be using assessment more to do diagnostic work with kids so we can give them more of what they need rather than simply to rank them, which is how we do it now. But I think you're absolutely right that we have to have a clear sense of both what should they learn, but then to make sure that they're actually being exposed to it and taught it by capable teachers. So.
Thank you both very much. If you will please thank our panelists. The discussion was wonderful. Right outside, we do have a bookseller with books from them both, and they're going to come out and sign, and Joe will be scattering out for a plane really quickly. Thank you again very much.